Well, thank you so much, Anna. Welcome back. And as Anna said, we'll have that number up on the corner of the screen throughout, so please do feel free to text in, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can. If we don't have time, we might have an extended time after 10 to, but don't worry, if you've got to get away by 10 to 2, we'll make sure that we have a gap so you can do that without feeling at all awkward. And also, I can see there are lots more coming in, so we'll allow them to come in as well. But we've been looking this week at the idea of searching for answers. We say, look, Christianity raises questions and life raises questions, and we're looking at whether there are real answers to those real questions. We don't claim to be able to have exhaustive answers to all of the questions we might like to know, but we do want to say we think there are sufficient answers to what we really do need to know. And so that's what we've been trying to look at this week. And we come today to what's possibly the biggest question of all, the question of suffering. Why would a good God allow suffering? You only need to look at the TV news on any given day, and you see suffering, don't you? It's a universal problem, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, Nigeria, evil, violence, and suffering happening on a daily basis. Just last week, we remembered 70 years since the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And we were reminded again of the horrific things that happened there. Why does God allow suffering? It's such a huge issue. Now, I'm aware some of you are coming in today, and this is not necessarily a personal issue for you at the moment. Maybe you're coming in and actually everything's great in your life. If it is, I want to say, I'm glad, okay? We're not wishing suffering upon anyone today. I'm glad that your life is good, but I'm also really conscious that there will be people here today for whom this is a really personal question. And actually, right now in your life, this is a question you're asking. And so, if you're not currently going through big questions of suffering, please allow me to speak more personally on this, not just philosophically, for those who are asking this personally. And can I also say, even if this is not an issue that you're currently facing in life, the sad reality is it will be an issue that all of us will face, at some point at least in our lives. Because suffering is something that will happen in different ways, at different times to each one of us. This is not just a philosophical question. It's a deeply personal one as well. And it's a deeply troubling question. You probably, if you've been on social media this week, maybe come across the interview that RTE did with Stephen Fry, where he was asked the question, if you were to get to the gates of heaven, you realize there really was a God after all, what would you say to that God? And in his response, which took the interviewer quite by surprise, he said this: "How dare you? How dare you create a world to which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that's so full of injustice and pain?" That's what I'd say, he said. Well, it's a big question, isn't it? Is this God a capricious, mean-minded God? At the end, he said this: "So atheism isn't just about not believing there's a God, but on the assumption there is one, what kind of God is he?" Now, actually, that's really helpful that he says that, because it reminds us that there are two kinds of objections that we might have to the Christian faith. The first are intellectual, and we looked at those on Monday and Tuesday, the kind of questions of what about science, what about the Bible, what about the historical evidence? But actually, they're not just intellectual, are they, if we're going to be honest? They're also moral. What kind of God are we talking about? What kind of God allows the kind of suffering we see in our world today? And so, along with Stephen Fry, many people through history, maybe perhaps many people here, have come to the conclusion there cannot be a God. God doesn't exist. Now, whilst I can understand in one sense why people might come to that conclusion, I'd also want to ask the question, does it really get rid of the problem, or does it actually create for us another problem? See, what I mean by that is this: if we are just the products of the evolutionary process and nothing more, if we aren't here, as it were, by chance, why do we talk about the problem of suffering? If this is just the way the world is, why should we expect that it ought to be any different? Why do we talk about the problem at all? Richard Dawkins put it this way. He said, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Actually, that's very consistent with the materialistic worldview. We can't really talk about the problem of suffering in such a sense. Or Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "There's no reason to whatever happens, no love in the things that happen to you, no place of ease is open to your hearts." So getting rid of God doesn't get rid of the problem, but actually raises a different kind of question altogether. But as a Christian, I have to say, there is obviously a huge question, and that is, if there is a God who purports to be love, well, how could that God allow the kind of suffering we see in our world, or the suffering that you've experienced in your life? So I want us to ask 3 questions, and then we'll have time for yours. Firstly, why is there evil and suffering in the world? Secondly, what, if anything, has God done about it? And thirdly, what will God do about it? But firstly, why is there evil and suffering in the world? After I did my A-levels in Leicester, I took a gap year. And for my gap year, I didn't chunder in the rainforests of South America like some people do. I worked here in W.H. Smith's on the high street of Leicester. And if any of you have ever worked in retail, you'll know the worst place in a shop to work is the customer service desk. Because that's the place where you get irate, particularly after Christmas, irate parents coming, bringing broken toys and games, wanting their money back. And my manager said, what you have to decide in this occasion, on each occasion has the problem been caused by a manufacturing fault, or is it the misuse of the owner that's to blame? Good question. And actually, I would suggest that's the kind of question we need to ask about our world. Manufacturing faults or owner misuse? Why has it gone wrong? And actually, the storyline of the Bible tells us that it's the latter. See, the Bible says that God creates a world that's good, a world without suffering, pain, and death. And into that good world, God creates people to enjoy that world, to enjoy each other, and to enjoy Him. And He gives those people a choice. He says, you can live in that world your own way, or you can live in it my way. Now, some of us might ask the question, why would God give people that kind of choice if He knew that that kind of choice would allow people to reject Him and muck it all up? But actually, choice and love go together, don't they? They have to. I mean, imagine if I met a girl this week in Cambridge and I ask her out on a date and we start going out, and after a few months, I decide to propose. And so we come back to Cambridge, we're walking one night down by the Cam, and it's a moonlit night like last night was, and I get down on one knee, I pull out a ring from my back pocket, and then I say to her, "You will marry me." Now that's only changing the order of the words, so I figure it's not too much of a problem, is it? And then I say to her, "And when you marry me, I want you to know that on Mondays you will cook me steak. On Tuesdays it will be curry, on Wednesdays it will be burgers, on Thursdays it will be pizza, on Fridays you'll do the washing, on Saturdays you'll do the ironing, and if you do it well on Sundays you can have a day off." Now you can understand with that philosophy on relationships why I'm currently single, can't you? Because that's not how relationships work. Not, of course, that people never do anything for each other in a relationship. Of course they do. They might even iron for each other. But they do it not simply out of obligation, but out of choice. For love to be real, choice must be real. And if God was going to create a world where love was to be real, there needed to be the reality of choice. And the tragedy of human history is that people have often taken that choice and that freedom and used it rather than to love, but to hate, rather than to help, to hurt, to reject God and to hurt others, and to make a mess of this world. And actually, when we're honest about it, it's not just people out there and people in other parts of the world that do that. We can do that, can't we? My choices, my actions, and even sometimes my inaction can contribute to the suffering of others as well. In one of their early songs, a song called Clocks, Chris Martin of Coldplay asked this question. He says, "Am I part of the cure or part of the disease?" So actually, the shocking thing that Jesus says is this, that the problem of evil and suffering is not just an external problem or a problem in the structure of society, but actually it's a problem in the human hearts. Jesus says this problem of evil and selfishness is something that we find in all of our hearts. That none of us are the people we should be. that all of us in some shape or form have contributed, at least in part, to the suffering of others. It's much more personal than we might think, and maybe that's uncomfortable to think about. Now, of course, there is suffering, isn't there, that isn't caused directly by people. You might, of course, say, well, what about a tsunami, or what about the Ebola crisis in West Africa? Who do you blame for that? And it would be a mistake of me to stand up here and say, yes, it was because of this person, or it was because of this evil. Sometimes Christians have tried to do that, always linking natural disasters to the sin of certain nations. And I think the Bible doesn't give us a basis to suggest that we can do that. We shouldn't. But it does say, on a kind of big picture level, this. It says that the world we live in is broken, and that the results of human beings' rejection of God were not simply located in our own personal relationships, but the effects of that are universal. Almost like a kind of virus that gets into your computer and affects the whole workings of your computer. So the Bible says this thing, sin is what the Bible calls it, has affected the entire workings of our universe. So in some sense or form, the world doesn't work in the way it should. One of the New Testament books says it's groaning, it's broken. Now, having said all of that, you might be saying, well, this isn't particularly good news, is it? My response would be, of course, what did you expect to talk on suffering? Because it's not going to be good news. But actually, in one sense, I'd say it is. You see, just pause for a moment and think about it. If this is true, if the Bible's story about the world is true, then actually I want to suggest it at least makes sense of the feelings that we have in the face of suffering. When I stood by the grave of a friend of mine a few years ago, something in me said, it shouldn't be this way. And the Bible says, that's right. Maybe you look at the suffering of people around you or your own suffering, and something in your heart says, actually, this isn't right. And you're right. It shouldn't be this way. The Bible says, actually, this world is broken. This is not just the way it should be. At least it makes sense. Our emotions are not delusions or illusions. They relate to reality because there is a real brokenness in this world. Something has gone wrong. That's the first question. Why is there evil and suffering? Here's the second question. What's God done about it? I wonder what your kind of mental image of God is. As Stephen Fry said, our problem is not just does God exist, but what kind of God is there? And so often our mental image of God is, at best sometimes, a kind of distant deity. A God who stands aloof and separate. A God who looks on maybe at the brokenness of our world, but of course he can't really know what it's about. He's God. He's not experienced it, we have. And yet this is the incredible thing about the claim of the Bible. And that is that the Bible says God hasn't stayed distant and aloof, but God has come into this world and has experienced this world and its suffering firsthand. The claim that we're looking at yesterday is that in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, God has broken into human history. Now again, if that was true, think about it. Think about how it happened. God was born not into poverty, not into riches, but into poverty. He spent 2 years of his life as a refugee. He lived in a country occupied by a cruel foreign power. He was rejected by his own people. He was deserted by his followers. He was betrayed by one of his friends. He faced injustice and torture and death by Roman crucifixion. And the claim of the Bible is that it was God himself that stepped into human history and experienced that. Now again, let me ask the question, if that was true, if that really happened, that kind of changes your view of God, doesn't it? Because God isn't one looking at suffering from the outside, but he's one who's experienced it from the inside. He knows what it's like. A couple of years ago, I was in Poland, and we went to, with some friends of mine, the Auschwitz concentration camp. And I'll never forget going round, seeing reminders of the horrific things that took place there. But I'll also never forget an engraving that was on the wall of one of those cells in Auschwitz. It's rough, but it's quite clearly the engraving of a crucifixion. And as I walked around this place where such horrific things have been experienced and asked myself the question, how can I as a Christian believe in God in the face of it? I was reminded of the God of the Bible, who also stepped into the horrors of this world and experienced it firsthand. It does make a difference. Edward Shillito was a poet. He lived around the time of the First World War. He fought in the First World War. He survived it, unlike many of his friends. And as a Christian, he really struggled with how he could face up to the horrors that he had seen and continue to believe in God. And he wrote a poem simply called Jesus of the Scars. And the poem goes this way. He said this: "The other gods were strong, but thou was weak. They rode, but thou stumbled to thy throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but thou alone." The God of the Bible is a God who has wounds. He's experienced it. And that does make a difference. Now, of course, you might be sitting here saying, well, okay, I'm glad that God can identify with me in my suffering, but does it really help me? Has he done anything about it? We want more than sympathy. We want action, don't we? I mean, imagine if I was to meet you tomorrow walking through the middle of Cambridge, and I asked you the question, how are you feeling? And you said to me, well, actually, Michael, I'm not feeling very well. I've got this terrible headache, and I'm just not feeling great. And I say to you, well, actually, I haven't got a headache, so I really can't sympathize with you, but wait a minute. And then I walk over to the nearest brick wall, and then I headbutt it really hard. And then I come back to you and I say, but now I have a headache too, and I can sympathize with you. We've both got headaches. Now, what would you be thinking at this moment of time? You'd probably be thinking, what an absolute idiot. You haven't helped yourself and you haven't helped me. Now we both need to go to Boots and get some paracetamol. See? We don't just want sympathy, we want action. Which is why if all God was doing was sympathizing with us, that wouldn't be enough, would it? And yet that's not what the Bible says. But rather we're given hints and clues and then clearer explanations through the New Testament that as God in the person of Christ stepped into our world, he wasn't just experiencing suffering to identify with us, but he was doing something about it. In fact, we're told that he was taking upon himself the causes, our own sin and rebellion, and the consequences, our rejection and brokenness of the suffering of this world. He was taking upon himself, and he was taking upon himself the ultimate consequences that we should face for it. And that he experienced that brokenness and that pain and that death, so that ultimately and infinitely and eternally we might not have to face it. He was separated from God so that we might be reunited with the God that we've so often rejected and turned our faces away from. He has done something about it, and he can reconnect us to the God who made us. He has. Now, of course, that doesn't answer all the questions. There are questions about suffering that we don't have answers to. And I have to say, when I think about my own life, there are lots of questions that I do not have specific answers to. You know, why was a friend of mine so tragically killed the other year? Why was a friend of mine raped on the way home from a party? Why did my uncle die of cancer? I don't have the answers to those questions. And it would be naive and glib of me to stand up here today and say, yes, being a Christian is easy. We've got all the answers. We don't. But what I think we do have is this. Not always the answer, but a realization of what the answer is not. See, if there is, just think about it for a moment. If there is a God who really did love us enough to come into this world, experience suffering, die in our place, so we can be reconnected to that God, if that really happens, the one thing I can't say about that God is that he doesn't care. And although I don't know what the answer is, I know what the answer is not, and it's not that he doesn't love me. God has done something about it. And lastly, we want to ask this question: what will God do about it? We're coming up to election time again this year, and people will be talking about the fact if you vote for them, they'll change the world, or at least they'll change Britain. But I guess most of us are quite cynical about the idea of change, because we live in a world that seems to just carry on the way it always has. Will things really significantly change? And yet again, the wonderful thing about the Bible is that it not only gives us the beginning of the story, but it gives us a hint about the end of the story as well. It says the world we live in is not the way it once was, but nor is it the world it one day will be. That somehow God is going to do something about this broken world. There is hope that God is going to fix it. Not simply that we're all going to float off to a cloud called heaven and play harps and go to choir practice for eternity, because that's not particularly doing it for me. I'm not sure about you. But it says there's going to be a new creation. That because Jesus also physically rose from the dead, there's hope for this physical world. And that's wonderful. Not simply that God is going to put it back to the way it once was, but somehow one day it will be even better than it was. I don't know whether you like the films Lord of the Rings, or maybe you've read the books. I've done both, but I watched the films before I read the books. But in the films, the favourite moment in those films comes at the end of towards the end of the second film, The Two Towers. And there's this moment when Sam and Frodo are talking together, and it seems like there is no hope. It seems like darkness is going to be victorious. And then Sam, my favourite character, turns to Frodo and has this incredible speech. He says this. He says, "It's like in the old stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and death they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. How could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was after so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness will pass, and the sun will shine again. And when it does, it will shine out all the clearer. Those are the stories that stay with you, Mr. Frodo, even though you're too young to understand why." Oh, it's beautiful, isn't it? You can tell it's beautiful because I memorized it. But it's beautiful. It's beautiful because I think something of Tolkien's Christian faith came through. Not simply will the sun shine again, but it will shine out the brighter. The message of the Bible is this, that not simply there is a day of hope, but somehow that because of our sufferings, that hope will be even greater. There is hope that God will one day do something about it. Well, I guess the last question, very briefly, might be this. If God could do something about it, and if he will, why doesn't he do it now? And I think the answer the Bible gives is this. Not simply that God doesn't care. He does. But rather that before God makes a new world, he wants to make new people. Before God sorts the problems of the world out, he wants to sort the problems of our hearts out. Because if the problem of the world is also the problem of my heart and yours, it's our hearts that needs to be changed, not just the world's. And that changes one heart at a time as we come to know not only the forgiveness, but the transformation that Jesus can bring. And that's what's on offer to each one of us. And so I guess in an audience like this, before we go to questions, my question would be, where are you at in regard to this? Maybe you're here and you're saying, well, actually, Michael, I've heard you 4 times now and I still don't buy it. You know, I just don't think this is true. What can I say? Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming back if you've come back. But can I challenge you? If you're going to reject the Christian worldview in the light of suffering, how does your worldview answer this problem? How will it make sense of the reality of suffering in your life? One to think through, isn't it? And are you really sure that the Christian faith is not too good to be true, but actually could it not be so good because it is true? Have you taken the time to look into it? Why not take away these books, simply called John, an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, and investigate for yourself and say, what's in it? Is it really true? At least at the end of reading it, you'll have the intellectual credibility to say, I've looked into it and I know there's nothing in it. But maybe you'll find there's more to it than you think. So take that away. They're our free gift. I challenge you to read it. It'll only take you a couple of hours. Maybe you're here and you're saying, well, actually, I'm intrigued. I'm not convinced yet, but I think there might be something in this. Well, I really hope that what you've heard this week will cause you to think, I need to look into this further. And the Christian unions across Cambridge are really wanting to help you do that. And each college is going to be giving you an opportunity to look into this more. And I'll tell you how you can sign up for that in a moment. But actually, maybe you're here and you're saying, actually, I have a sneaking suspicion that maybe this is true. And actually, I would love this to be true because I would love to know this hope and this reality in my life. And you're thinking, well, what do I need to do about it? Well, the wonderful thing is, this hope and this forgiveness and this transformation can become real for you. Firstly, it requires us to admit that we need it, to admit that the problem is not just out there, but it's also in here. Secondly, it needs us to come to that point of asking for it, to say to Jesus, thank you for what you've done for me. Thank you that you're willing to mend my heart before you mend the world's. And then thirdly, it requires us to say to Jesus, please come on board in my life and take control and start to change me from the inside out. And he will. And maybe there are some of you that are ready to do that. And I'd really encourage you to seriously think about it, but not just to think about it, but actually to talk to this God who is there and to get that started for yourself.